What if I told you that the generation nobody talks about has quietly figured out something the rest of us are desperately trying to learn? Not through therapy, not through self-help books, not through mindfulness apps, but through something far more brutal and far more effective. Adversity. Real, unsupervised, consequence-filled adversity. Generation X, the people born between 1965 and 1980, are the most psychologically underestimated group alive today. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why their particular brand of resilience might be the most important survival skill a human being can develop, and what every other generation can actually learn from it. Before we can talk about what makes Generation X psychologically unique, we need to understand what resilience actually is at its core, because most people get this completely wrong. Resilience is not the ability to avoid pain. It is not positivity. It is not grit in the motivational poster sense of the word. Psychological resilience, as defined by researchers like George Bonanno at Columbia University, is the capacity to maintain relatively stable, healthy levels of psychological and physical functioning when confronted with highly disruptive events. In plain language, it means you can take a hit and keep functioning. Not because the hit didn't hurt, but because your nervous system has been trained, consciously or not, to absorb shock and recalibrate. Here's where Generation X enters the picture. Their resilience wasn't built in a gym or a workshop. It was built in empty houses, on paper routes before dawn, in front of televisions broadcasting the tail end of the Vietnam War, in the shadow of nuclear anxiety, and through watching the adults in their lives make promises that evaporated. The architecture of a Gen X mind was constructed under conditions that modern developmental psychology would look at with serious concern. And yet, that architecture turns out to be extraordinarily load-bearing. Let's go somewhere most people haven't considered. What actually happens to a child's brain when they spend significant time unsupervised? By the early 1980s, approximately 7 million American children between the ages of 5 and 13 were regularly home alone after school. These were the latchkey kids, a term that originally referred to the house key worn around a child's neck because there was no adult home to let them in. But beyond the sociological label, something neurologically significant was happening inside those children's brains. When a child is consistently placed in an environment where they must make decisions independently, what to eat, how to manage their time, how to handle fear, how to solve a problem with no adult guidance, the prefrontal cortex, the brain's decision-making and executive function center, gets activated earlier and more frequently than in children who have constant adult oversight. Cognitive development researchers describe this as accelerated executive function development. The brain essentially learns to treat itself as its own supervisor. Now here's the critical piece. This doesn't come without cost. Children who develop self-regulation under these conditions often simultaneously develop what psychologists call hypervigilance, a state of heightened alertness to environmental threats. The same child who learned to be impressively self-sufficient also learned to read a room the moment they walked into it, to anticipate problems before they materialized, to always have a backup plan because backup plans were sometimes the only plans. This is the neurological fingerprint of Generation X, and it explains a behavior pattern that younger generations often find baffling. Why does this person always seem to be waiting for something to go wrong? The answer is not pessimism. The answer is pattern recognition built from a childhood where things frequently did go wrong and where the cost of being unprepared was real and immediate. Psychologist Julie Norham at Wellesley College has spent decades studying what she calls defensive pessimism, a cognitive strategy in which people set low expectations for outcomes in order to manage anxiety and motivate preparation. Her research consistently shows that for people who use this strategy, it actually works. They perform better. They prepare more thoroughly. They are less derailed by failure because failure was already part of the mental model. Generation X didn't read Julie Norham's research. They just lived it. Watching their parents' generation preach the gospel of stability while quietly dismantling it, soaring divorce rates through the 70s and 80s, mass corporate layoffs that gutted loyal workers, political scandals from Watergate to Iran-Contra that made authority look not just fallible but actively corrupt, Gen X absorbed a lesson that no classroom could have taught. The official story and the actual story are almost never the same, so you prepare for the actual story. This is why Gen X employees tend to show up differently than their colleagues. They are not the people who believe the CEO's town hall presentation about the bright future ahead. They are the people who, while everyone else is applauding that presentation, are quietly making sure their skills are sharp, their network is warm, and their financial cushion is as thick as they can make it. Not because they want the company to fail, but because they've watched enough movies to know how the third act usually goes. And here's the counterintuitive truth that the rest of us need to sit with. In a volatile, uncertain, complex world, which is precisely the world we all live in now, defensive pessimism is not a liability. It is a competitive advantage. Now we get to what I think is the most psychologically fascinating aspect of Generation X, and the one that is most frequently misread by the people around them. Gen X is simultaneously one of the most emotionally defended and one of the most quietly loyal generations alive. And those two things are not contradictions. They are products of the exact same experience. When your childhood teaches you that emotional vulnerability has real consequences, that asking for help might not yield help, that expressing need might not yield comfort, you develop what attachment researchers call an avoidant adaptation. You learn to self-soothe. You learn to present a composed exterior regardless of interior turbulence. You learn that irony and dark humor are not just entertainment, but armor. If you crack the joke first, the painful thing loses some of its power to wound you. But here is what people miss about avoidant adaptation. It does not mean the person doesn't feel deeply. It means they've learned to feel deeply in private. Generation X has some of the fiercest loyalty you will ever encounter in a human being, but it is loyalty expressed through action, not words. They don't tell you they have your back. They just show up when your back needs covering. They don't post about the friend they helped move last weekend. They just rented the truck, drove across town, and didn't say another word about it. This is profoundly important for workplaces, for relationships, and for understanding what motivation actually looks like when it isn't performed for an audience. Research in organizational psychology consistently shows that employees who derive intrinsic satisfaction from competence and reliability, as opposed to external recognition and visibility, tend to produce more consistent, higher quality work over time. Gen X doesn't need a shout-out in the company newsletter. They need to know they did the job well. That internal metric is both their greatest strength and sometimes their greatest source of suffering, because it means that no amount of external praise ever fully lands. Generation X graduated into an economy that seemed to be playing a cruel game with them at every turn. The older end of the generation entered the workforce in the early to mid-80s during a brutal recession. Many of the younger end graduated college directly into the dot-com collapse of 2000 and 2001. And then, just as the generation as a whole was hitting the age when you're supposed to be accumulating wealth, building equity, and establishing financial security, 2008 happened. The financial crisis didn't just wipe out retirement accounts. It shattered the last remaining belief that the system was fundamentally designed to reward those who followed the rules. What emerges from repeated economic trauma is not just financial caution. It is a complete restructuring of how a person relates to institutional systems. Generation X became, almost by necessity, the original gig economy thinkers, not because they celebrated the gig economy, but because they understood intuitively before the term even existed that relying on a single income source from a single employer was a form of dangerous naivety. Multiple income streams, tangible skills, ownership of their own competence rather than their employer's goodwill. These became the psychological infrastructure of financial survival. There's a concept in behavioral economics called loss aversion, the well-documented human tendency to feel losses more intensely than equivalent gains. Gen X has been loss-averse since before economists had a popular name for it. And while loss aversion can become paralyzing in some contexts, in others it produces exactly the kind of careful, deliberate, contingency-based decision-making that prevents catastrophic mistakes. The person who never quite believes the boom will last forever is also the person who doesn't go all in at the top of the market. Here's something that will never be replicated. Generation X is the only generation that learned to acquire knowledge the hard way. Through physical effort, patience, and genuine uncertainty about whether the answer even existed, and then watch the entire epistemological landscape of human civilization transform around them in real time. They spent hours in libraries. They navigated card catalog drawers. They called information hotlines. They asked experts who were sometimes wrong and had no way of knowing it. Knowledge for them had weight. It had texture. It cost something. And because it cost something, it was valued differently, encoded more deeply, held more carefully, applied more deliberately. Cognitive scientists describe something called the generation effect. Information that requires effortful processing is retained more reliably than information passively received. Generation X's entire childhood was an exercise in effortful processing. This is why when you give a Gen X person a problem they care about, they tend to go unusually deep. Not because they're showing off, but because depth is the only mode they know. And then the internet arrived. And they built it, adopted it, and watched it change everything, including eventually the nature of expertise, privacy, and social connection, in ways that confirmed every instinct they'd ever had about visibility being dangerous and information being power. Generation X will not be the ones telling you any of this. That's not their style. They'll keep showing up, solving problems that other people haven't noticed yet, carrying institutional knowledge that organizations will only realize they needed after the person who held it has quietly retired. But the psychological lessons encoded in their generation are genuinely worth studying, not out of nostalgia, and not to rank generations in some pointless competition, but because the conditions that shaped them are returning. The world is getting more volatile. Institutions are becoming less reliable. The gap between official narratives and ground-level reality is widening. The skills that were forged in the latchkey crucible, radical self-reliance, contingency thinking, loyalty expressed through action, resilience built from repeated loss, are not relics. They are roadmaps. The bridge generation doesn't ask for credit. They just hold the weight. And if you're smart, you'll spend some time learning how they do it before the bridge is the only thing left standing. If this gave you something to think about, share it with someone who deserves to understand it. And if you want more deep dives into the psychology that shapes the way we all live and work, subscribe, because there's a lot more where this came from.